Hello everyone and welcome to episode 40 of the Layton Fitness podcast. Now in today's episode we're going to be discussing whether it's necessary to be getting stronger within every single session within the context of hypertrophy muscle growth. And there's so many different nuances to this question. The reality is it really depends, which I'll discuss within the podcast. But in addition to that, I'll also discuss a few things that may be hampering your strength gains. So if you're doing some of these, you could eliminate them and hopefully you'll start seeing some more strength gains. It's going to be a combination of those two factors. It's important to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. So with regards to muscle growth, hypertrophy, the overall goal is increasing training volume over time. And as discussed in some of my previous podcast episodes in detail, the load needs to be heavy enough. So it's not just volume, it's volume coupled with the magnitude of load being heavy enough. And as a result, that usually requires using a multitude of rep ranges and focusing ultimately on getting stronger within those rep ranges. So as such, that's the overall goal of increasing volume over a chronic period of time with the caveat that load's heavy enough. So the biggest factor by far is training age. If you're an absolute beginner, you really should be getting stronger pretty much every single session. Because you're new to training, it's so much easier to add load toward your lifts pretty much on a session by session basis. With that being said, the more advanced you become, it becomes that much more difficult to make progress by session. That's not to say that shouldn't be the overall goal, and if you can make progress session by session, that's great. However, that's where periodization comes into play, and you're now really focusing on making progress over a longer period of time, maybe every 4 weeks, but ultimately over a block of time, i.e. 6 to 12 months, we should see a chronic increase in strength volume for an advanced trainee. So that's probably the biggest difference there. So therefore, if you're a beginner, you really should be striving for progress every single session. If you're an advanced trainee, you're looking for progress over a longer period of time. And as an advanced trainee, this really is a big psychological shift, and it becomes quite difficult mentally to first become used to. But as soon as you accept that, things become much more easy because you become much more patient. You focus more of a periodized approach rather than just a shotgun approach when you're in there just without a plan. So I think once you understand this, it really does help with your progress as an advanced trainee. Another big point I want to make is there's obviously a huge difference between making progress with your compound lifts and your isolation movements. So compound lifts is basically a multi-joint movement where you've got multiple muscle groups working at the same time. So for example, squats, deadlifts, bench press, overhead press, or other pressing and rowing variations, any of those big compound lifts. It's obviously much easier to make progress more rapidly just because the loads you're using are heavier, therefore it's easier to add loads to the bar. With that being said, for things like your isolation movements, like your bicep, tricep movements, lateral raises, things like that, it's much more difficult to make progress on. So therefore it's important to distinguish the difference between the two. You're really focusing the majority of your time on increasing the loads for your compound lifts, and by default those isolation movements should progress but at a slower rate and usually behind the big compound movement. Now, as discussed briefly above, this is why periodization is so important. The more advanced you get, the more periodized approach you'll need to continue to make progress. Another big point with regards to gaining strength is deload. So basically a deload is a week where you're using sub-maximal loads, and ultimately the goal is to recover sufficiently before then going into the next training cycle. And there's lots of different opinions on deloads, and ultimately the importance is to take them at some point, whether you use more of a structured deload where you schedule this every 4 weeks, every 8 weeks, every 12 weeks, or whenever it is, or you use an auto-regulation approach, which is what I pretty much use for all my clients, is basically deloading when required. So when there's a decline in strength for a period of time, when the client is under-recovered, this is a time to implement a deload. Another big point which may affect your strength gains is obviously your nutrition. If you're not recovering sufficiently from session to session, this can obviously hamper your gains. So make sure you're consuming sufficient protein and also sufficient calories. And this brings me on to my next point. It's obviously much more difficult to make strength gains in a deficit. Maybe not acutely, however, over a chronic energy deficit, it's going to be much more difficult to make strength gains at the same rate as a chronic gaining phase, where calories are slowly increasing over a period of time. Another big point that may affect your strength gain is an interference effect. If you're trying to combine too much endurance training with strength training, this can have an interference effect where your body's obviously trying to adapt from the endurance training component, additionally it's trying to adapt from the strength component, and both of them interfere with each other. Now, that being said, does that mean you can't do, say, any endurance training? So, for example, you did, I don't know, a run or cycle once a week? No, I'm not saying that, but if you're doing a large amount of endurance training coupled with a large amount of strength training, there will be an interference effect between the two. Another big point which can affect your strength gains is not having sufficient rest between your sets. This is such a key point especially with your bigger compound lifts. You really want to rest sufficiently in between sets, and traditionally I don't really set rest periods for my clients because ultimately it's not really necessary. By having too short rest periods, this can result in reduced loads and thus reduced volume, and therefore this can hamper our strength and muscle gains. Another huge point which can hamper your strength gains is stupidly slow tempos. Now, and the reason being, a lot of you may be under the illusion that tension is the biggest determining factor for hypertrophy, and ultimately the load needs to be heavy enough. Therefore, if you use a stupidly slow tempo, this can obviously negate some of the load being used and therefore hamper strength gains, hamper volume gains, and therefore hamper muscle gains. So with that being said, I'm not saying don't control the eccentric portion of any lift. I do suggest doing that, but don't do any of these stupidly slow eccentrics where the loads are so far reduced that you're hampering load and volume, and basically putting the cart before the horse, as Eric Helms would say. You're putting your tempo focus ahead of your volume and strength focus. So just remember that. Obviously you're focusing on keeping perfect form, but you're putting volume strength gains first. Control the eccentric. Don't spend more than 1 to 2 seconds lowering the weight. Another key point which may hamper your strength gains, it sounds really obvious, but you'll see so many people that continue to do this is cardio immediately before the weight training session. You're doing this immediately before, you're not going to have the same energy levels to perform the same lifts at the same loads as you would normally having no cardio prior to the session. If you're going to do any cardio, do this immediately after the session, completely another time of the day or another day completely. Make sure you're prioritising that weight training component first. So hopefully you found this useful. Hopefully you can see the difference between strength gains, how frequently you should be making them for a beginner, and as you get more advanced, you're focusing on progress over a longer period of time. And then in addition to that, hopefully you can see maybe perhaps some of the mistakes you're making which may be hampering your strength gains, which can then hamper training volume and thus muscle gains. If you're still yet to download my free ebook, How to Set Up a Nutrition Plan, you go to James Layton, Layton Fitness.co.uk and download that immediately. If you also go to the site, you'll see all of my other podcast episodes, in addition to all of those episodes being on iTunes. Subscribe to the podcast, see all of the videos and blog articles on my website, and you can also learn more about myself and my services and products on the website as well. So thank you very much. I look forward to speaking to you next week. Take care.